Funding for Idaho Reports is provided by the Friends of 4, 10, and 12, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by a grant from the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation.
Recessions and depressions that come by periodically and produce so many problems and so much unemployment largely are the result of bad monetary policy. I think if people just simply understood how badly the Federal Reserve has managed this economy, they too would say we've got to make a fundamental change there.
Tonight, a rather unconventional view of the U.S. economy with economist Lawrence Reed.
Good evening. You just heard economist Lawrence Reed at the beginning of this broadcast do some bad-mouthing of the Federal Reserve Board. Conservative Republicans like Jack Kemp and Steve Sims have been doing a lot of that too lately. The Republicans, in fact, wrote that bad-mouthing into their platform recently in Dallas. But as you see as we talk to him tonight, Lawrence Reed can also do some bashing of basic conservative economic theory. Lawrence Reed is currently the chairman of the economics department at the Northwood Institute, a private business school in Michigan. He's presently on leave doing postgraduate work at the University of Colorado. Our interview with him was videotaped last week while he was in Idaho for a speech to the Center for the Study of Market Alternatives in Caldwell. Since it is sometimes hard these days without a scorecard to tell where an individual economist is coming from, I began by asking Lawrence Reed just what kind of economist he is.
Well, I think it's fair to say that I'm a believer in the free market. I'm a private enterprise economist. I believe that the best arrangement for society, economically speaking, is a free economy in which government is confined to certain minimal functions of protection of life and property. I believe in sound money and, well, basically a lot less government than we have today.
What is government's proper role in the U.S. economy? Does it have any role?
Oh, I think it does. I think government should act as a night watchman, as a referee. I'm also convinced that if government did nothing more than act as a night watchman, as a referee, that it would have a full-time job. What I mean is that people should be basically allowed to go about their business in peace, to live out their lives as they choose, and if they should invade the rights to life and property of others, then government should be called upon to stop that.
And I take it as part of that general view of the world that the government has gone much too far in inserting itself into all aspects of life, particularly the economic aspects of life.
Yes, I believe that.
In your view?
Yes.
Well, with that basic statement in mind, let me ask you about a few specifics. The Republican platform recently adopted claims to be a free market platform. Is it?
Well, I've not had the opportunity to study most planks in that platform just yet, and I really think that platforms of political parties have little meaning. There are so many people in both parties, including the Republican, who espouse free market principles. They may even put that down on paper, but sometimes their idea of private enterprise is for special business interests to get favors from the government. And Republicans have done some of that in the past.
Give me an example.
Oh, I think the funding that the Republican Party, as well as the Democratic Party, have supported for the Export-Import Bank is one way in which government subsidizes some of our largest corporations. The recent bailout of multinational banks by the appropriation of Congress of $8.5 billion for the IMF as another example. I don't see private enterprise as in any sense meaning government and business cooperation. I think it means that government acts as a night watchman, a referee, but doesn't pass out any favors to anybody. So I'm going to look beyond the platform and watch how office holders of any party actually act.
Well, let me ask you this then. Is Ronald Reagan truly a free market Republican?
Oh, I think his basic instincts and what he actually does sometimes differ. I think his instincts are very strongly pro-free market, but he's a political office holder. He's the president. He has to compromise on many things, and whenever that happens, you can say that he didn't carry through. He's not a 100%er. I have some sympathy, however, for the politician who tries to implement ideals but faces a whole raft of special interests, and if he dissatisfies all of them, he's out of office and can't do anything. So I think Reagan has, of necessity, politically speaking, has had to compromise and cave in from time to time.
Well, let me ask you about a specific, again, that sort of dominates the political discussion of the moment. Walter Mondale says whomever is elected in November will have to raise taxes next year as a way to shrink the federal budget deficit. The Republicans say no. Make some sense of that debate for us.
Well, I don't think anybody has to raise taxes. That's a decision that Congress will make. If they decide to raise taxes, it will be because they haven't got the political courage to cut federal spending. And I'm of a belief that we have gotten so far down the road towards high taxes, even though we've made some reductions, that it's not at all clear that higher tax rates will bring in more revenue. So it may be counterproductive to do it in any case. But I think that what we should be talking about is ways in which we can bring down the deficit through further spending cuts, not higher taxes.
If higher tax rates won't necessarily bring in more revenue, is the converse of that true, that lower tax rates, as supply-siders suggest, will not bring in more revenue also?
It can. It depends on which taxes you're talking about, and it also depends upon what the time frame is. Arthur Laffer of California has often put it this way. He says if you charge $5,000 to go across a toll bridge, you have a very high rate but no revenue because nobody will take the bridge. If you charge $5, it's a much lower rate, but you'll have some revenue because some people will take the bridge. At 50 cents, you may have a very low rate, and you may have bumper-to-bumper traffic and highest revenues. So I do believe that over the long pull, cutting tax rates does provide the extra incentives that people need to work, to save, and to invest. We've done a lot of damage to our economy with high tax rates, but these things take time. And you can create a much bigger deficit very quickly by cutting tax rates. It may take a while before the incentive effects of the lower tax rates produces greater revenue.
Well, that's the situation we have now, is it?
That's true, and the deficit is coming down. It's not as large as it was projected to be. We were looking at a deficit of perhaps $200 billion for fiscal '84. It's likely to come in at about 165 or 175. But we really haven't tackled the spending side like we should. There is a very large, as some people call it, a structural deficit. A deficit that's going to be there regardless of what we do in producing more revenues through lower tax rates because Congress is simply spending too much.
What is the ultimate danger of that deficit remaining as large as it is, or perhaps even getting larger, as some suggest?
Well, the deficit is a symptom of some very bad thinking. It is that we want a lot of things, but we don't want to have to pay for it. The impact of it is going to be felt primarily in coming years when we ask future generations to pick up the tab for the things that we want now. We are eating our seed corn with this huge deficit. We are consuming our capital. We're living far beyond our means. We're at a party right now. It feels pretty good. But the long-term impact is that future generations will not live as highly as ours is.
The GOP platform does what some have referred to as some Fed bashing, criticizing the Federal Reserve Board for its essentially tight money policy, I guess. How do you rank the job that the Federal Reserve has done, say, over the last year?
Well, over the last year, it perhaps is better than it has been over the past 40, but I still can't get too friendly with the Fed because I think it is the principal engine, it is the sole engine of our inflation. It has conducted monetary policy in a very bad manner since its inception in 1913. I think it's our inflationary monster. People talk about tight money. They say Paul Volcker has been very tight. Actually, Paul Volcker has been all over the place. Since he has been chairman of the Fed, we have seen periods of a few months at a time in which monetary policy has been tight, but we've also seen some of the most rapid expansion in money supply growth in our history since Paul Volcker has been in charge. It's this unsteadiness, this vacillation from very rapid money growth to very tight money growth that I think has been the hallmark of the Volcker tenure, and it has simply added to the problems of the economy.
Both major parties are right now talking a lot about tax reform. The Republicans have adopted in their platform again what they call a modified flat tax. Mondale's talking about tax reform in some way. What sort of tax reform do we need other than to cut rates?
Well, if we could do that, we'd accomplish far more tax reform than we've seen in the many bills that have carried that name. But beyond simply cutting rates, I think movement towards some sort of a flat tax is a good idea. I think a flat rate tax with few deductions or exemptions would go a long way in taking the disincentive effects out of the present progressive structure.
And by a flat tax, we mean, in essence, everyone paying the same percentage of tax.
That's right, 10% or 15 or whatever it might be. I've seen figures that indicate that perhaps a flat rate of 18% across the board with no exemptions or no deductions would produce the same total revenue as today's tax system does. I don't know the validity of those figures.
How would it be fairer?
Well, it would be fairer because it opens the door to opportunity. It doesn't say to people, as our present system does, that the harder you work, the more successful you are, the better your judgment, the more investments you make, the more you're going to get socked by the government. That's what's unfair. The present progressive system penalizes incentive. It discourages thrift. It discourages hard work and investment. It says to successful people, in effect, that we're going to make life more difficult for them. And I don't think that's the kind of signal that we want to send.
Yet we would have a lot of businessmen, I would venture to say, in the home building industry, for example, who might not like to see us do away with a mortgage exemption.
Oh, that's right. Over the years, we've had all sorts of special interests who have benefited by one kind of law, one kind of tax arrangement or another. That's always the problem of changing anything in government. You've built up a special interest. How do you convince them that they shouldn't have their goodies? Maybe in the short run, the thing to do is to move towards a flat tax that retains some of those deductions and phases them out perhaps over many years. I've not worked out a precise formula as to how to get from here to there, but since you've asked me where we should go, I've told you, a flat rate tax, it might take 10 years, but that's the proper direction.
Let me go back for a moment to the so-called supply side theory. One of the elements of that theory, at least as I understand it, was that by cutting particularly corporate tax rates, we would stimulate corporations to make major investments in new plant and equipment, to innovate, to conduct research and development, and make better products. Has that happened?
Well,
as a result of the Reagan tax cut, I mean, in 1981.
It's begun to happen, and if you look at particular tax rates, you can find some remarkable evidence to that effect. If you look at the reduction in the capital gains tax, which really started down under Jimmy Carter. It was as high as 46%, I believe, and was brought down to 28% before Reagan. Under Reagan, it was lowered to 20%. We have seen new life in the venture capital market. It's been remarkable. In fact, at 20%, on the capital gains tax, we're raising more revenue at the federal level today than we raised when it was at 46%. There we've seen substantial new growth. Now, in the recovery from this recession, it's true that consumer spending picked up first. And only in the past 6 months have we begun to see large increases in business capital spending. But there's a good reason for that. Businessmen have been cautious. They've been burnt over the years by inflation, by off and on monetary policy, and I don't think that they were ready to accept the Reagan program as any kind of a permanent feature. I think they wanted to see definite signs that inflation was under control and that we were going to keep these tax rates down. And so only lately have they begun to participate in a big way in capital spending. But if you can send long-term signals, if people in the financial community get the message that government isn't going to cut their taxes this year but raise them next year, that this is a long-term change, that it's safe now to invest, they'll invest.
Of course, some would suggest that that economic recovery that we have, or the president at least says we have, was a classic Keynesian recovery, a liberal economic recovery, if you will, in the time-honored method.
Well, in many respects it has been. The tax cuts have helped. I don't think the recovery would have been as pronounced and as helpful as it is without the tax cuts. But by and large, the recovery came because of a change in monetary policy. Now, you realize that the typical Keynesian would say it was the mere fact that the government spent more than it took in that has produced the recovery. Well, I never have believed that. If the government spends more than it takes in taxes, it gets the money from someplace. Nothing brand new is created. They're simply redistributing. What they can't get from your pocket, they take from the capital market through the borrowing. That's not where the stimulus comes from. The stimulus comes from the money creation that is needed to finance those deficits. And if you look back to June of 1982, the Federal Reserve began expanding the money supply at a very rapid rate. The stock market saw it in August of '82 and began to take off, and the rest of the economy began to respond in November and December of that year. So to a great extent, this recovery has been induced by new levels of money creation, and that's dangerous for the long term. That makes me very uneasy. But the tax cuts have been a help, not a hurt, but not the main cause.
But when Arthur Laffer drew out that, the now famous or infamous, depending on your point of view, Laffer curve on the cocktail napkin, as the story goes, and Jack Kemp pushed the Kemp-Roth tax cut in the Congress, and Ronald Reagan was running for president saying he would cut our taxes more than it actually turned out that the Congress would allow him to. No one ever said we'd have a $165 or $70 billion deficit, did they?
No, and few people calculated on the monetary policies of the Federal Reserve, which produced the recession. Way back in November of 1980, the Federal Reserve, after having expanded the money supply at a very rapid rate, in fact, from May of 1980 through November, they expanded the money supply by some 17%. Then beginning in November, they slammed on the brakes and brought that growth rate way down. In fact, for a few months, they actually contracted the money supply. That's what sent us into the recession. Had the recession not interrupted the administration's efforts, we would have seen a much smaller deficit.
So the Fed bashing that some Republicans like Jack Kemp want to engage in is on the mark as far as you're concerned.
In many respects, yes. In fact, I would not only bash the Fed, I'd abolish it.
Okay. Let me move on to another area that has received a lot of attention economically, both in the last couple of years of the Carter administration and certainly in the Reagan administration. That's deregulation. I would suppose in general that you would favor most deregulation efforts.
Yes, as a principle, I do.
Airlines, trucking, telephones.
That's right.
What benefits have we seen?
Well, you realize...
Let's just take airlines, for example. What benefits?
Well, we've seen new levels of competition. We've seen, I should back up and point this out, that the deregulation that we've seen has been partial in many respects, not total. In fact, the continuing effects of some regulations and the bad way that we have deregulated has produced some of these problems. The best example is not airlines. The best example I can think of is the telephone communications. What we should have done is to have never given any degree of monopoly privilege to AT&T in the first place. They did a great job as it was, but we should have left the door open to competition from the very start. We didn't do that, so a few years ago we decided to start to deregulate. But the problem was we coupled that deregulation with a forcible breakup, a divestiture of AT&T, and I think that's been harmful. We should have said to AT&T, all right, you've gotten as big as you are in part because the government has given you certain favors and protections. We're not going to do that anymore, but neither are we going to break you up. We're going to turn you over to the market and let competition do a number on you. But instead, we broke up the company and have lost some of the efficiencies and the economies that came with that large scale. So some of the competition that has come about through deregulation has been countered by the bad effects of the way we went about it, the breakup.
Could, in a practical sense, though, AT&T's competitors compete with it were it still AT&T,
Oh.
the old AT&T.
Yeah, you know, every time I hear that sort of thing, I think of the phrase, "Oh, ye of little faith." Just because I don't know how to compete with AT&T doesn't mean that nobody else can. All that's necessary is for government to stand aside, keep the doors open, and entrepreneurs, if given free field, will whittle down the size of anybody. I mean, the guy who started MCI well before the AT&T breakup, he wasn't concerned about how big AT&T was. The history of American business enterprise is the history of countless thousands of corporations who have become very large and are later beaten at the competitive struggle by smaller companies. At the turn of the century, we had American Woolen, American Molasses, and Central Leather, giants of their day, no longer with us because competition drove them out. So I don't know how to build a jet airplane either, but some people do. And allow a free field and open doors, and competition will do its job.
Aren't there some downsides to what we've done with deregulation? Some negatives?
Well, in the short run, yes, there's a shakedown. So there'll be bankruptcies. There have been some. Airlines, there have been some bankruptcies. That's the fault not of the deregulation so much as it is of the prior regulation. So it's a painful process to deregulate.
Well, let's don't worry about those folks who happen to suffer, an airline or a telephone company that happens to suffer. What about the consumer? Aren't there some downsides for him as well?
Well, there have been some trade-offs. Downsides, yes, but in most cases it's come about because we've gotten some other benefit. I think the real test of whether deregulation is going to be helpful is going to come in the long term. We've only done this in the past few years, and we've only done it partially. And it's going to take time, but I am convinced that deregulation, by opening the doors to competition, will only be helpful to the consumer.
Even if in a state like Idaho it prices a telephone out of the market for somebody who lives in a rural part of the state who can't afford a telephone any longer?
Well, now there's something to be said for those who choose to live in a faraway place to pay the costs of living there. I think there's a basic injustice in requiring someone else who doesn't live in those straits to subsidize that person. So there will be a reordering of some priorities there, some rearrangement of fee structures. And you realize if the phone company had been operated like the post office has been, then you could make a telephone call any place in the country. It would cost the same as any place else, but that phone call would be of a tremendously high price. So I think we're going to get closer and closer to a situation where people will pay the cost of providing the service. And that hasn't always been the case.
Let me give you another example. Right now, if you or I wanted to fly from Boise, Idaho to Portland, Oregon, round trip, it would cost us about $300. We could go to Newark, New Jersey, and fly to London, round trip, for something like $227. Is that the way the market's supposed to work?
Well, you're asking me a question that requires me to know a great deal about the degree of competition and state regulation and so forth in this particular area, and that I can't tell you about. I can tell you that the low fares on the transatlantic route are due to deregulation. There was a time when the CAB was preventing any newcomer from challenging the existing airlines.
Well, I guess some would make the point, though, that the high rate between here and Portland is also due to deregulation.
Well, I don't know that the final verdict is in on that, and so my specialty is not airlines, so I'm going to dodge
Well, I know,
that.
I don't mean to put you on the spot on that one particular example, but I guess the larger point that some people are making is that there are downsides to deregulation, and there are the kinds of downsides that perhaps can only be mitigated by the hand of government, if you will, intruding on that marketplace. In other words, is it in society's best interest to have a person who lives 100 miles from the nearest town in Idaho to have a telephone and to subsidize that person having a telephone? I hear you saying it's not really in society's benefit to have that person have a telephone.
Well, there are a lot of things that benefit society. I mean, the fact that you and I took a bath this morning benefits people that we associate with during the day, but it doesn't mean the government should get involved in making sure we take baths. It doesn't follow that because that something benefits somebody, the government ought to provide it. I don't think that it would be in the consumer's interest for the government to come in and tell an airline company that if you want to service a certain route, you have to charge this price and no more. I think the effect of that could be quite the opposite.
But you're saying and suggesting, and I think a lot of people would agree with it, that that the marketplace will handle the allocation of these basic access to things like telephones and airlines.
Well, it handles it a lot better than politicians do. It's not perfect, but a lot better than politicians or bureaucrats can handle it.
Okay. If you could make, as an economist or as a person who thinks about policy and the way a government makes economic policy, if you could change one thing, what would it be? To make the system work better. You said you'd abolish the Fed. Would it be something like that?
Well, a lot of things have to happen before we get that far. But I think I would do that. I think that so many problems that we encounter in the economy stem from mismanagement of the nation's money supply. Recessions and depressions that come by periodically and produce so many problems and so much unemployment largely are the result of bad monetary policy. I think if people just simply understood how badly the Federal Reserve has managed this economy, they too would say we've got to make a fundamental change there. So,
do we replace the Fed with something?
Well, Milton Friedman says replace it with a computer. Simply have the computer meter out a proper money supply each year.
Someone has to program the computer, though.
That's right. In my belief, that might be better than what we have, but I think we should be thinking about moving towards a commodity-based money, a gold standard, if you will. In my belief that there's a lot more work that needs to be done in explaining how we can get from here to there, but I have much more faith in gold as money than I do when politicians are in charge of it.
Why?
Well, the reason that politicians don't like gold is that they can't print it. I don't know of a single civilization in all of history.
The Iraqis invade Iran, and the price of gold goes through the roof for no apparent reason.
Well, it's not so much that the price of gold that's fluctuating; it's the price of paper money in relation to gold. You know, we've had periodic dollar crises too, and they have caused a great deal of damage. Now, a gold standard is not perfect, but it would exert a discipline upon politicians. It would tell them, if you want to have all these programs, if you want to spend a lot of money, you've got to pay for it now. I would couple that with spending reductions and a constitutional amendment to balance the budget.
Well, Mr. Reed, good to talk to you. We've exhausted our time, unfortunately.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Enjoyed it. That's all for tonight. We'll be back here tomorrow night with other news permitting. A look at a suggestion recently made by House Speaker Tom Stivers, a 10% across-the-board reduction in state employees. The Speaker, among others, will join us tomorrow night for a discussion of that idea. We'll see you then. I'm Mark Johnson. Good night.
Funding for Idaho Reports is provided by the Friends of 4, 10, and 12, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by a grant from the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation.